Senator Branden Petersen, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Senator, you're coming to the Senate after a term in the House, and I was watching an interview that you did right before the 2011 session, and essentially you were telling the story on how you were a reluctant candidate even then, having turned down initially the request to run for the House. You obviously changed your mind. Right. You won that seat. So what did you gain from that experience, and is public service now kind of in your blood?
Absolutely. Well, it was a great experience. I served the district that I grew up in as well, which something I mentioned in that first interview.
Coon Rapids.
Yeah, Coon Rapids, Northwest Coon Rapids, Andover, Ramsey, and Anoka. And it's just a great honor to serve the people that you grew up with and your neighbors and friends and family that all live there. The first session was, I know, historically unique, and we covered pretty much everything that seemed to that possibly could have happened. You know, I mean, from the shutdown, the contentious budget battle with the governor, a lot of very significant reforms in education, which I worked on with the administration as well as my legislative colleagues. So it was a very eventful first 2 years.
And you did serve, as you kind of mentioned, you served on the education committees and the property tax subcommittee while in the House. So what are some of the priorities you plan to pursue here in the Senate?
Well, the next 2 years is going to be critical, especially in the area of education policy. And I'll continue to continue my work in the Senate, hopefully working in a bipartisan manner with the respective chairs, Torres, Ray, Senator Uyghur, and Senator Bonoff. This legislature is responsible for the implementation of the teacher evaluation law, which we passed in 2011. The department will come back to the legislature during this session to implement its recommendations, and that's going to be a very important conversation for students and teachers across the state of Minnesota.
So, Senator, given your work in the House Education Committee, there are proposals floating around the Capitol that would change the per pupil funding. What do you think of some of those that are being discussed at this point?
Well, I think most of us would be open to reforming the funding formula. Right now, it's very complicated. There are great variances in regional funding from the inner city to the suburbs to rural Minnesota. I think members will be open to that conversation so long as those regional considerations are being considered. If you're talking about increasing the state's obligation to public education, I think we're going to go back and take a look at some of the things that were done in the past, in particular when we moved away from the general education levy, for example. One of the replacements to that was the statewide business property tax, and the rationale was that was there to offset some of those other things that were being eliminated. We would hope that if there's a move back in that direction, that obviously statewide business property tax will see a reduction considerably. But generally, we believe, I believe the GOP caucus believes that public education is a fundamental part of state government, and we're committed to making sure that we have equitable funding in all the districts.
And it doesn't tend to be a party line conversation typically. So given that there's usually some bipartisan support and bipartisan opposition to such proposals, do you think people can come together and find a way to allow the state to pay more for per pupil funding if that is indeed the proposal that makes it through? And would you support increasing revenue if it comes to that?
Well, we have some additional revenue to work with, so I would absolutely support dedicating more revenue this biennium than we did in the past. I think it's necessary. I also think that, again, those regional considerations in terms of funding, making sure that our rural members in their districts are being taken care of, as well as the inner city in the suburban districts. As long as all of those things are balanced, I think we can find some common ground.
Senate Majority Leader Tom Bach cited property tax relief as a very high priority for the Senate this year. What are some of your thoughts on tax reform?
Well, I think tax reform, as it's been called, can take the shape of however the reformer wants to do it. I mean, property taxes are important. Of course, most people know that property taxes aren't set at the state level, with the exception of the statewide business property tax. So the question is, how exactly are you going to affect those local governments, and how much resources it's going to take to do that? Tax reform, if it means increasing taxes potentially on small business owners and families. That's going to be something that I'm personally going to be a little bit more reluctant to support. But I think there's general merit in broadening the base of taxes, making the tax system a little bit more reliable. Some of those things I'm open to.
Okay, now you've had 2 years in the legislature. How will those experiences aid in your work here?
Well, I think, like I mentioned at the outset, I mean, we in the majority encountered some very exceptionally difficult circumstances. And we made some choices, in particular, to balance a budget without raising taxes. I think, in general, that worked out pretty well. Now we're left with a smaller deficit at the beginning of this biennium, but we were coming in with a $6.2 billion deficit. This legislature has a $1.1 billion deficit, so we moved the ball in the right direction. I think we have some bipartisan agreement that short-term budget mechanisms aren't necessarily the right answer, and so hopefully we can live within the revenue stream that we have to accomplish those ends.
What about in terms of Minnesotans speaking out and saying that they were upset with the gridlock that caused the shutdown? What did you learn as far as working with colleagues, and how will you translate what you learned there into the Senate?
Well, I think obviously there's going to be less gridlock with one-party control of state government. The Democrats control the House, they control the Senate, they control the governor's office.
People were saying they wanted to see some bipartisan support, though. Are you in favor of that, or are you in favor of, will you kind of stand back if you really don't support something? You know, kind of talk to me about where you are on this scale of compromise.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I'm not concerned with whether it's a Democrat idea or a Republican idea. I'm concerned with the merits of the idea itself. So I'd have to know exactly what that issue was, but absolutely. In particular on issues surrounding early education, surrounding education funding, I have a lot of agreement with Democrats. And in the House, for example, I was one of 8 House Republicans who supported maintaining the early education grants we had in the Education Omnibus Bill. So I have reached across the aisle on some important issues, especially in education, and I will probably continue to do so. So,
Senator, what are some of your expectations as you transition over to this body?
Well, coming from the House, of course, there's always kind of this friendly competition between House and Senate colleagues. And one thing I know is it's much more formal. I didn't wear my tie today, but I'll have to, wear a jacket and a tie every day. And I know that the Senate holds itself in high regard in terms of customs and usage of the body, and that's going to be. I'll have to make sure I address the president and make sure I keep things at maybe a higher decorum than we did in the House. It's a little bit more rambunctious over there. But aside from that, I just look forward to getting to know my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, just like we did in the House.
And how about expectations for the legislative session?
Well, I mean, again, serving in the minority will be a new experience for me. My expectations, I'm hoping that the Democrats will live up to their word to work in a bipartisan manner. And as long as they make those overtures, being in the majority, I'll be receptive in trying to work with them.
Okay, Senator Branden Petersen, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah.
We really appreciate it.
Thank you.